Hello and welcome back to another episode of the Eden Red podcast. We're in the international break now, but don't worry, we've got you covered. This is today we're recording with someone that we wanted to record with before the season started, but just some availability issues really. But I was actually just saying to Craig before we started recording, maybe it's a little bit better that we've got Jon on after Brentford have played a few games, after the season started, and we kind of know a little bit about what's to come. Not too much, but obviously we know a little bit from the first three games. So Craig, how are we, mate?
Yeah, very good. Very good. Thanks. Happy after our first three games. So let's hope we can carry on the way we're going.
Good stuff. Good stuff. And delighted to say we're joined by Jon Mackenzie, writer, presenter at The Athletic. Jon, thank you so much for taking the time to join us, mate.
Yeah, thank you for having me. It's not often I get the chance to chat in depth about Brentford, so I appreciate the offer of coming on and chatting with you.
And we're more than happy to do that, I can tell you that.
We do that every week, so we're used to that around here. But just before we get going, remember to drop a comment down below, subscribe to the YouTube and Spotify channels. Also give us a follow on our socials, at the Eden Road on Twitter and at Eden Road Pod on Instagram. Just before we start, I thought I'd signpost the structure of it a little bit. I want to talk about last season, just a touch in terms of the kind of football Brentford season, just a little bit. And then we'll move on to the kind of Brentford specific stuff that's happened this season. People that Jon know that we don't know. Shout out to Bernardo Cueva. That would have been a really good guest to bring on. But Jon knows a lot about him, so we'll talk a touch about him as well. And then we'll talk about the wider Premier League in general, just in terms of this season, how much we can take from the first three games, etc. But as I said, let's start with last season. Jon, how did you find last season, and just in terms of enjoyment, standard of football, any tactical changes that you might have spotted, anything like that?
Yeah, to be honest, I'm kind of interested to hear from you guys about what you made of last season, because I think last season, at least according to the underlying numbers, but what we saw from Brentford was a little bit of variancing down. So maybe putting in like mid-table performances across the board, and then finishing a little lower than you might have hoped to. And obviously, because the way that the season panned out, some of those results sort of came midway through the season, and there was a point at which people were like, "Oh, could Brentford go down at any point this season?" And in the end, you guys pulled away. But the numbers suggest that you were very comfortably mid-table. So I guess I'm sort of interested to hear what your takes are on last season, because I guess it is easy to get sort of influenced by the league table rather than the actual performances and numbers.
Well, I think the justice table, from what I can remember, the last time I looked at it in terms of expected points, we were about sort of 15. So we weren't that high, we weren't that further up from where we actually finished. But I think in terms of the season, Craig, it was shit. I can say that from the start.
Yeah.
Like it was not fun watching so many key players go out with injuries so early on, and they just didn't stop. And it was just that there were turning points in the season. I felt like the game against Everton at home, I felt that was the really bad one, or the really first bad performance that we saw. And then as more and more players started to get injured, the performances just progressively got worse and worse. But I didn't, bar maybe a couple of performances, I'm thinking maybe, Craig, West Ham away, Burnley away, potentially. There weren't any games, I thought, where it was like, shit, we might actually go down. Like it, as the injuries came, more people started to think that. But performance-wise, I don't know, Craig, how do you feel?
No, I'm going to go the other direction. More games that we had, the more worried I was. You mentioned two, and then I think about Everton at home. I think about Wolves at home. Now, I'm going to throw one out there. It's one you can't really take much from, but it's all about performance at the end of the day. Liverpool at home, when they done us 4-1 or whatever it was, and it was just dreadful. We had so many conversations last season saying, oh, gosh, what happens? What happens if we actually go down? And Callum was always the positive one, which is weird, saying, we're not going to go down. We're not going to go down. And like Jon said, it seems like we were very comfortable, but every Brentford fan will tell you that was the squeakiest season we've had in the Premier League.
I was just going to say, I'm looking at a run of fixtures. So this is like match week 15 to 20, and you lose all 5 games. So it's Brighton, Sheffield United, Aston Villa, Wolves, and Palace. But only one of those games is there like a massive discrepancy in the expected goals numbers, which is the Villa game, and even then it's one expected goal difference, which is actually the eventual result. But yeah, you put up more XG than Palace, lost 3-1. You went pretty much even with Wolves, lost 4-1. Went even with Sheffield United, lost 1-0. Went bang on even with Brighton and lost that one 2-1 as well. And I think that was the period which really put you guys on the ropes midway through the season and had people thinking, oh, this could be it?
Is that Brighton away? You're talking about Brighton away in that run. That was the Brian Mbeumo injury, which kind of just threw the whole season into limbo. And from that point onwards, we had no sort of offensive output, and it just in that spell of games where we just couldn't get any sort of flow or rhythm, really, really, really worried a lot of us.
And I think the thing with Brentford is that I think whenever I watch you guys, like, you get your upside from having really bang on structure. Every player knows exactly what they're supposed to be doing and does it. And you rely on certain players to give you offensive upside. And if, like you say, if any of that goes, that's when those poor results start coming in. There's such a fine margin for error when you play that way. Okay, it's maybe like lowest common denominator good football, I would call it, maybe, where you're just simply trying to get all the fine margins in place. But as soon as you then miss, your anyone in your front line, you lose Ivan Toney for the chunk of the season. Brian Mbeumo is not available, and then it's like, well, where are the goals coming from? And I guess the big question going into this season is, are those fine margins going to be back? Do you have the front line firing again? Is there a little bit more positivity about what's going on here?
We're definitely going to have the frontline fire. Or at least it looks like we're going to have the frontline firing again from our first 3 games. Just fingers crossed they stay fit. John, just before we move on to Brentford this season and the first kind of 3 games, I've heard you speak on podcasts before about Brentford and Thomas Frank. But what's for the people that don't know, like what interests you about Brentford? What's interested you about Thomas Frank since Brentford have been promoted to the Premier League?
Yeah, I guess I don't want to jump too far forward down the running order that we've got, but I think the fascinating thing for me about Brentford is it's the fact that their recruitment during the Championship years was incredible, and their recruitment in the Premier League years has been pretty poor, to say the least. And yet, so you have this weird scenario where, on the one hand, I feel like your Championship recruitment has carried you in the Premier League, whereas your Premier League recruitment has maybe stagnated you a little bit. And I think that's such a fascinating contrast of situations, because it doesn't make sense, right? It seems like on the one hand, I think it's easier to do smart recruitment outside the Premier League because, there's very little money involved. So it's very hard to make quote unquote mistakes as long as you're going for players who are going to improve you. But then it does seem to me like odd that you then go into the division up and then seem to not be able to pick the kind of players that will step you up to the next level. And I was looking the other day for just prepping for the podcast, the TIFO podcast, and looking at your top 10 signings per fee of all time, and it's just there's obviously some okay players in there, but like almost none of those players you would say have reached the potential that maybe you would have expected them to reach when they were brought in. And it's still the players that came out of nowhere that have really been the ones who kicked you on. So we talked about Ivan Toney, but Brian Mbeumo, I guess Johan Worcester fits sort of into the Premier League recruitment, turning good. But then I talked a lot about on a recent podcast that your midfield, like your £8 million midfield of like Vitaly Anelt, who's 500,000 euros from the Zweite Bundesliga, and then 3.5 million euro signings in Jensen and Norgard, they've just been like they've been the standard, and you brought in other players and it's never really worked out. You've been unlucky with Josh Da Silva, I'd say, but like beyond that, it's mad to me that a team of essentially Championship players have been able to perform so well across the board in the Premier League. So I guess it comes back to what I was talking about before, which is I don't think Thomas Frank is doing anything from a tactical point of view that is super interesting. I don't think he's doing anything that's out of the ordinary. I think what he's doing is he's doing good coaching. He's keeping the team where they are by instilling his ideas into, as basic as they may be, into players, so that the players know what their responsibilities are. They know what they're supposed to be doing in every phase of play. They benefit from the fine margin. So the backline behaviors are always really good at Brentford. So everyone in the back line knows when to step, when to drop. Obviously, set pieces has been a high point for Brentford in the Premier League years, and that's given them a huge amount of upside. So for me, I just watch it, and it's like, this is what you can achieve without having maybe like high end elite talent, but through coaching and having a process and having a system and a coach who buys into that process and system and is able to translate those ideas to the players. So for me, I think that's what Thomas Frank's Premier League era has been sort of typified by.
I think as well, the continuity aspect of it, like Thomas Frank, he must be one of the longest serving, if not the longest serving manager in the Premier League at the moment. Now Klopp's gone, Guardiola as well.
I
But
think he was
the
the
fact
third longest serving.
he was
I
in
can't
the
remember.
EFL as well. It wasn't just Premier League either. But yeah, in terms of like working with those players, the Championship players that you mentioned, like a lot of people that don't watch Brentford all the time won't realise that spine of the team hasn't changed like at all, really.
Yeah.
And the signings that you mentioned since we've come up to the Premier League, I'm thinking of the likes of Keane Lewis-Potter and Mikael Damsgaard, Nathan Collins. They really haven't. Like you bang on. Like one of the bugbears from Brentford fans last season, because the results weren't going good, or because the results were going badly, was that we've spent a lot of money on some of these recruits since we've been in the Premier League, and they haven't done as well as we'd have expected for injuries or form, or they can't get in the team ahead of someone else for whatever reason. But just to end that on a little positive note, Craig, I'm hoping that this season, because Mikael Damsgaard has started well and Nathan Collins has started well, I'm hoping that first couple of years, or the first year in Collins' case, was maybe just like a bedding in process. But let's hope. I understand where you're coming from in the recruitment so far. If you're looking at the money that we spent and what we've gained from the players that we brought in, it's nowhere near as good as the money that we spent during the Championship, the players that were still there. But what are you? What actually you said about set pieces, so I feel like maybe that's a good point to come in with Bernardo Cueva, because we've lost him to Chelsea, someone you know well, and I know that you rate really highly. What was his level of involvement at Brentford? How much will we miss him?
Yeah, I mean, essentially he was running all of the set piece routines. So for a team who relies on having, bang on set piece process to lose the guy behind it, I think is obviously going to be massive. I think you replaced him with Keith Andrews, which surprised me a little bit, because I don't believe he's been a set piece coach before. I don't know whether or not they've shuffled things around in the backroom staff, but yeah, from my experience of knowing Bernardo and the conversations I've had with him, just an incredibly interesting guy, incredibly committed guy, committed to excellence through hard work, I would say. And yeah, the system that he was using when he was, I think he joined the summer when you lost in the playoffs. So I think he had the next season when you were in the Championship and the promotion from then on in. So he's been around for a while, but I just think the numbers speak for themselves. When you look at any of the set piece data, you can see that the creativity and just how well drilled everything was. It was clear to me that he was special. I'm not surprised that he's ended up at a club as big as Chelsea from there. So yeah, I think it's funny because I think a lot of my friends who are sort of smart football knowers were sort of teasing the idea of Brentford going down this season off the back of Bernardo not being there. So that's the extent to which people rated him. I personally actually disagreed with them, because I was of the opinion that I think that Brentford are comfortably good enough to stay in the league, and I think people are maybe slightly underrating them based on what we talked about with the numbers last season, where they put up sort of give or take, and you should never just go off the numbers, but like they were putting up good enough for mid-table team performances. Yes, they're going to lose a big part of that in Bernardo, but I also think that it was pretty likely that they were going to swing up this season anyway. So I just sort of expected it to balance out and have Brentford finishing like 15th ish, which again you as fans you want them to do as well as possible, but like I don't think it was ever going to be in danger of you being in a relegation battle, especially with the teams that were coming up as well. So but yeah, Bernardo, fantastic guy, really smart. The system that he had in place is incredible. He's talked to me about it. He's very cryptic about it, of course. He didn't want to give away any of his secrets, but the communication for me is like one of the biggest aspects. Yes, you've got the creativity. Yes, you've got the players sort of being able to self-organize, but the fact that they can communicate what set piece routine they're doing with non-verbal communications that you know, he always said to me, if you ever spot any of our non-verbal like communications and tell me after the game, I'll buy you dinner or something. But I never could, right? So it's stuff like that. And he's talked to me before about bringing the complexity of the way that they set up for set pieces. So the just the expectation they have of what the players need to know in order to be able to run through their set piece routines. Talked to me a lot about, for example, Christian Eriksen being a player who came in and was very quick to pick up a lot of the ideas that he was instilling. And again, you know, that's the kind of thing I think that indicates that, you know, this isn't just, we turn up and we'll have maybe 2 or 3 training ground, as they call them, techniques, and then 1 or 2 just other ad hoc things. This is very much, everyone knows what they're doing. Everyone knows in what order they're doing things. Everyone is ready to make the set piece routines tell when they need to. And I think just that aspect of it is super impressive. And everyone else in the Premier League has been playing catch up to him, I would say. So yeah, really impressive guy. And I think, as I said, the numbers speak for themselves.
Well, we've already scored, I think, 1 goal from set piece this season, which was the throw in against Southampton, which Whistler scored. So hopefully, like you said, Keith Andrews can kind of kick on where Bernardo Cueva left off. But John, you mentioned the midfield 3 and our recruitment in the Championship. Going into the Premier League, it obviously seems like it hasn't been as good as what maybe it was in the Championship. And at that level, you feel like there's a level playing field where there's no one big team which is going to push on the rest of the teams like we do have in the Prem. So what do you kind of think is like the kind of where the frustration's coming from with Brentford fans with the transfers that we've had, or maybe the lack of successful transfers that we've had in the Premier League?
It's interesting, isn't it? Because I'm just running through the list of the most expensive players you've brought in. And in the top 10, there's no one really who I would consider to be like a classic centre midfield option. So there's lots of like forward options. So you've got Igor Thiago at the top. Kevin Schade obviously brought in. Fabio Carvalho, I guess, is going to be played in the midfield, but to me sort of feels like a wide forward in a front 3. Keane Lewis-Potter, same. Mikkel Damsgaard, again, I know he's played in the central midfield at times, but he, again, feels like a wide player in a front 3. And then everyone else is like Nathan Collins, Sepp van den Berg, Christopher Ayer, Aaron Hickey, Mark Flecken. They're all defensive players. So it's sort of weird that, I mean, we talk about how they've not really replaced those 3 that we mentioned at the beginning, but it's not even felt to me anyway like they've really tried to replace them in any sort of meaningful way in the Premier League, like with a big signing there. And whether or not that's because Frank is so happy with what the 3 of them give, I don't know. That said, I do remember distinctly some games last season where I sat in the stadium and I was thinking, there's just a dearth of central creativity here. If Jensen's off it, there's not much coming, right? I was at the Wolves FA Cup game. Was it the FA Cup where I can't even remember the result, but I think
If it was
1-1 draw,
1-1 when they was down.
Yeah, then it went back to theirs. That's right. Yeah, but that was a game where the Wolves scored like super early on. I think through Tommy Doyle, like pinged one in from miles out, and then the rest of the game, obviously Brentford were just trying to break them down, and it was just constantly like shoehorning, horseshoeing backwards and forwards either side. And I was thinking, yeah, what do you do in that scenario as a team like Brentford when you actually come up against a team who are going to block you out? Where does that creativity come from if you don't have someone like Ivan Toney as a sort of target man link-up player in the box? It was very obvious that in that sort of scenario that Brentford didn't really have any sort of solution there. So yeah, and look, like, obviously the way that you play, a lot of it is geared towards being really good in transitional moments or being really good in direct moments, doing lots of wing play, creating channels to attack, and then having really good, finishers and runners with the ball in behind in players like Mbeumo, Schade, and Visser as well. But yeah, I guess that's the question then, I suppose, that we're going to come on to is like, how do you take the next step as a team like Brentford? And again, I think Brentford have been set up as a team who are designed to stay in the league, to be good enough to stay in the league. And once you get to a point where you're like, okay, well, we've stayed in the league for quite a while now, how do we avoid just becoming Crystal Palace, right? And make that step. So
when
interested to hear your thoughts on that as well.
Yeah, when you think about the transfers that we had in the Championship compared to the ones that we've had in the Premier League, what do you when you think about them, what do you think is sort of the biggest issue with the transfers that we brought in? Like, is it the problem of competing with bigger teams in the Premier League, or just not looking for that player who's got like Premier League experience under their belt already, which when we brought Christian Eriksen in, just worked, didn't it?
Yeah,
it just worked for us.
I think that's a good example, because like a lot of the transfers that you brought in the Premier League, I guess you could maybe bucket into two groups, one of which seems to be like reclamation projects. So I'm thinking players who've like consistently maybe had injury issues, and you think, well, we can find value there. We're going to try and do smart recruitment and find value there. So I'm thinking, players like, so Kevin Schade, maybe he played very few minutes for Freiburg when you guys bought him. I think under 1,000 minutes in the Bundesliga at that point, and had these. He was getting these sort of groin problems because he's such an explosive player. I guess he was putting a huge amount of pressure through his groin. And I remember early on thinking, I wonder whether or not they've sort of gone early on this guy because they believe that they can find value, they can beat people to him, because they feel as though they can manage his injuries. Obviously, Mikkel Damsgaard is another example of that, right? A player who came in who'd had knee injury issues. I think there was talk of him having some form of like arthritic condition, at one point. And again, that felt like someone who everyone was quite high on after an international tournament. I can't remember which one, but again, this idea, well, let's try and find value in the market by bringing someone like that in and then manage the minutes well, and then you can do it. And again, I talked about on one of our shows recently about how Bournemouth have done this super well by having a really good rotation of like midfield options, so that they can bring someone like Alex Scott in, who at the time had an ACL injury, and they've been able to manage his minutes super well. And he's not really had many injuries since he's been at Bournemouth. And there's other players as well that they've brought in and been able to manage their injuries. But so there's that bucket, I would say, on the one hand. And then on the other hand, there's like weird signings, I would say, where it almost feels like you've perhaps overpaid for players. And I don't know whether or not that is because you feel, well, we think this player is going to be great, and in order to compete with other, like you said, Premier League sides, in order to get them, we need to just absorb that cost. So I'm thinking Keane Lewis Potter is obviously a good example of that. Like 19 million euros at the time, as 22, 23, I think. It felt like a lot of money for him out of the Championship, right? And he's obviously not kicked on to the extent that you would have wanted him to have kicked on. Igor Thiago, even, like, again, it's maybe unfair to talk about him at this point because we're yet to see what he can actually do at this level. But again, it felt like good player, but maybe a slight overpay in terms of what other clubs might have been offering. Like Sepp Vandenberg, like, again, like, harsh to judge him at this point in his Brentford time because he's not really played yet. Apart from, I think he played in the Carabao, didn't he? But it's a lot of money for a sort of relatively unproven player from another Premier League side. And again, I'd be interested to hear your guys' thoughts on this. It feels almost as though you've overpaid on a bunch of players, and you kind of think, well, if you're going to overpay, why not just overpay on like you say, bringing someone like Christian Eriksen in, where it's going to work fine. It feels like you're almost overpaying on speculative prospects, and then on the other hand, maybe trying to bring in players who've been injured, and it feels as though it's like, well, let's be smart here and like find value and make sure we manage players' injuries. But it's just a massive risk, and like very few of the players on that list that I read out, you could argue, have been successful players for them. With the caveat again that, for a lot of these players, Igor Thiago, Kevin Schade, Nathan Collins, even Sepp Vandenberg, Fabio Carvalho, that's your top five. They're all very, very early on in their Brentford career. So maybe, in 3 years' time, we'll look back and be like, what a wally John was talking about all of this stuff. But at this point, right, it seems as though the direction of travel has been underwhelming Premier League transfers. And the question is, like, what are you going to do to actually make the step up to start bringing in those players? And maybe someone like Fabio Carvalho is one of those players. But it does feel like, especially in that central midfield, you just need like a statement good player now to raise the level, and that will have a massive impact on what the club is able to achieve.
Well, I think the thing is, we've tried like that in terms of bringing in these unproven players and maybe paying a bit too much for them. The three examples that come to my mind straight away of proven players that we've tried to get are Johan Bakayoko, Nico Gonzalez, who's just gone to Juve, and Archie Gray, who got pinched from us from Spurs. So it's like what Craig was saying earlier about we're now in the Premier League and we're trying to like unearth these gems, but there's not as much dirt on them as when they were in the Championship. So a lot of people are seeing them as well, and a lot bigger clubs are seeing them as well. So we're kind of competing with that. And there was a lot of frustrations from our fans when the Archie Gray deal fell through. And it was kind of like, well, we don't know really what's happened in the situation. It sounded like he changed his mind, but also the chance to play for Spurs is probably definitely a much more attractive prospect than the chance of playing for Brentford. Whether he'll do better at Spurs or at Brentford, we'll never know. He probably definitely would have got more minutes, and maybe would have been that kind of statement signing that you're talking about in terms of that midfield. But it is just difficult. I feel like there's a lot of frustration from the fans because maybe the signings that we've made, they've not really fulfilled their potential. I mean, Keane Lewis-Potter, I feel so sorry for him, Craig, because we've spoken about it so many times. He's played like last season in every position apart from his preferred position. And when he's actually played at left wing, he's actually really good. And Hull fans used to rant and rave about him. So there's definitely... It's definitely fair to say that Brentford's recruitment, when we've been in the Premier League, has been not on the level that it used to be. But I think that may be partly due to consequences out of our control. Like I look at Brighton and they just continually, like in the Ben and Bloom derby, in terms of like recruitment, they're just continually unearthing these gems like everywhere, and they're still managing to do it. Whereas maybe ours has kind of faltered a little bit. But coming on to what you said about sort of where did Brentford go? We don't want to become another Crystal Palace. I think it was JJ Bull was talking about it on the TIFO podcast about what is next for Brentford. This fourth season in the Premier League now. How do we get to where we were a couple of seasons ago, really close to Europe? And how do we kind of sustain finishing in the top half of the table and not thinking about survival every season? So I think we do have to think about it. I think Thomas Frank said, every season outside the top 6, top 7, top 8, whatever you want to call it now, every other club has a chance of getting relegated. But when you watch Brentford and you watch maybe the last couple of seasons, what do you think in terms of what's next?
Yeah, I mean, it's interesting hearing you mention Brighton, because I think a lot of people would naturally throw Brentford and Brighton together, right, as smart clubs. But obviously, given everything we talked about, it doesn't feel that way in terms of like the recruitment processes that both teams use. And it's super tough, right, to make the step up, because when we talk about making the step up, what do we really mean? We mean you have some good signings who raise the level and then get picked up by someone further up the food chain, right? So I think that part of the reason why Brighton are successful is because they just accept that as a reality, and they say, well, fine, if we're going to be good at recruitment, it means we have to be good at recruitment long term. You can't just be good at recruitment for a couple of windows. You've got to be ready for the fact that if you do your job well as a recruitment department, you are then going to be creating more work for yourself. So I think that's sort of what I think that Brentford really need to do, because I think as we talked about at the top of this show, what Brentford do super well is they have solid players who do everything correctly, and you do play a sort of very tentative form of football. You play mid-block football. You look to hit teams on the break. You can bed in against big sides and defend really well around the box. And yeah, you've at least in terms of like recruitment, you've largely got like defensive signings like pretty good. Ben Mee actually is an interesting, just as an aside, right? Here's another example of like a proven qualities Premier League centre back who you've brought in towards the end of his career. And those are the two options, right? When we're talking about good recruitment, it's like Christian Eriksen for a season on loan and Ben Mee. And again, like that's one way of it's not a particularly good way of finding value, right? But it's a good way of finding quality in the league. So again, maybe more signings like that to go along with what you would hope is a more successful, peak age player or youngster market as well. But yeah, I think that the problem comes when you play that way, that you're always scared that if you change the way that you play, you then put yourself at risk of going down, right? And so you almost get caught in this vicious cycle of being like, well, we know that if we carry on playing the way that we're doing and we are able to refresh the squad relatively well, then we'll not go down. but then you end up in these scenarios where you're like, well, you can do that and nearly go down. Like you could argue last season that was the case anyway. Or you could just end up doing this forever and just like never going down, but never really kicking on. So I suppose that's the big question, is like, where do you start fraying the edges of what is successful but maybe uninspiring? And I guess it is tough, and I guess Brighton have done that through bringing in exciting coaches who sort of fit this game model that they've implemented, and they're able to do that. I suppose that's sort of true with Brentford as well, but it feels, like you said before, it feels so long since Brentford had a new coach. It's sort of hard to know how they would negotiate or navigate bringing in a new coach as well. But I guess for Brighton, they did implement like an exciting game model. They were happy to bring in a coach like Roberto De Zerbi, who and then build their recruitment around that, right? So they brought in like every exciting wide forward in Europe this summer seemingly, and they're going to build a system which tries to get the most out of those kind of players. And it's been enough to get them into Europe, and now they've become, rather than a team trying to stay in the Premier League, they've become a team trying to yo-yo up and down into Europe and not. And it sort of works quite nicely on the finance side of things, because the seasons where you don't get Europe, you can spend a little bit more because you don't have to agree to UEFA's cost control in those seasons. So you can sort of have a season where you spend a bit of money, build your squad up, have fewer games anyway, try and get into Europe, and then the next season, try and get as far as you can in Europe. And it's quite a nice little model. So, but at the same time, like that's not just something you switch on, right? It's a long-term strategy where you do have to take risks, right? They did have to go for Roberto De Zerbi. That was a risk. They've gone for Fabian Herzler, who's, again, like, I think going to be a good coach, but there's the possibility that you're bringing in a coach who's had one good season in the Zweite Bundesliga. Well, that's unfair. He obviously came in the season before and turned things around, but like, he's not had a huge coaching career. That's a risk. And I think I get the impression from Brentford that like they maybe err on the side that the ownership and the leadership group, that they err on the side of small c conservatism, like making sure that they don't push the boat out too far, just to make sure they stay in the league until they feel as though they've got a comfortable footing enough to then maybe make the next step. So I guess that's the thing, right? What do the ownership, what do the leadership group decide to do next is what's going to determine whether or not Brentford like make that step up, or whether or not they lose they lose nerve a little bit, and then you get caught in sort of maybe relegation battles if they upset the comfortable model now.
Wow. You've mentioned all of those sort of Brentford players, the high value players, Sepp van den Berg, Nathan Collins, Fabio Carvalho, and then you throw Ben Mee in there. arguably Brentford's. Firstly, Thiago as well, 30 million, 2 goals against Wimbledon in the pre-season friendly first game, smells like a Ballon d'Or in the future to me.
It'd be hard to argue anything else, I think.
Mikel Damsgaard, I will fight tooth and nail for that man. He can do no wrong. I will fight tooth and nail.
It's been nice seeing him doing a little bit better towards the end of last season and this season as well, right? Because he had a tough old time. I remember sitting in the cricketers after a game and hearing people chat about him and just being like, why the hell is Damsgaard being played? I'd go for a drink with Bernardo and people would be like, why are you playing him? He's not doing it. It's nice to see the turnaround for him.
I do. I'm gagging for a Mikel Damsgaard goal. The first one that he gets, and he was absolutely robbed against Sheffield United last season. But it's Ben Mee. And Mike might agree, Mike disagree, but I'm sure he will agree. Ben Mee is arguably the best free transfer we've ever done. The best free transfer player that we've ever bought in. And then he goes on and wins player of the season in his first season after that free transfer.
He was like a real quality raiser, right? You could see the difference when he came in. And okay, maybe you've not been, when you bring a player in like that, you're like, okay, we're going to just try and get as much out of him as possible before he obviously has to move on. But, that can be a good way of getting, the odd season, like just adding a bit more. I mean, there's leadership qualities there as well, but adding just experience, leadership qualities, but also like talent, ability above what you would be able to, like if you were buying Ben Mee, now at the age of 23, you'd be paying a shit ton of money, right? So I
Yeah.
guess that's the thing, right? It's like, how do you find this value? How do you get the balance of everything, right? Because you don't just want to be a club that's just bringing in young players, and there isn't, like, even Brighton, right, brought in James Milner and have found value from playing him. So yeah, I guess for me, that's what you have to start sort of experimenting with. It's not just about finding value. It's not just about finding financial value. It's about finding player quality value as well in certain ways. And you've done that with Ericsson. You've done that with me. And yeah.
Well, go on, Mike.
Greg.
You were going to say something.
I was just going to say, you said, first of all, what I was going to say, which, having thought about it now, I'm not going to say. But when we were talking about sort of kind of taking that next step, I was going to interject and say, is it money? Is it that? Because Matthew Ben has recently put like a stake of the club up for sale. So like, I've been on other podcasts before, and I've said, and they've asked me like, where do Brentford go next from sort of, you know, consolidating themselves in the Premier League for 4 seasons now. And I've said it's difficult to kind of maybe take that next step without further investment. But then you look at a Brighton who have made such amazing signings and made a shit ton of money from doing so, and then they can be the second biggest spenders in the transfer window this year. So
the problem is that they sold everyone to Chelsea, and you only got Bernardo Cueva across there. So that's what you need to do to make the next step, is to become attractive to Chelsea.
Yeah, no, I agree. Go, Craig, you go in.
Well, we Mike mentioned about Thomas Frank and whether or not he can take us sort of further than what we've got so far. And you mentioned the higher uppers and whether it's breaking the mold of that comfortability in football. But speaking about Thomas Frank, I while we was talking, I did have a little Google. Thomas Frank is 41 days off of being 6 years as Brentford's coach. He is the 4th longest reigning manager in the Football League, 2nd in the Premier League, obviously behind Pep Guardiola, as Mike mentioned. There was a lot of talk over the summer with Ten Hag possibly leaving United, and Chelsea looking for managers, and well, they're always chopping and changing now, it seems, at the moment. And a lot of talk about Thomas Frank. And then there was the Danish job as well. What sort of ceiling does Thomas Frank have, do you think? Where does he... What can he do in his managerial career? Because I know, as a Brentford fan, I don't want to see him go to another Premier League club. I would rather see him go to the national team, so we don't have to go against him. But like, where does his future take him? You know, how high do you think he could really go?
Well, I mean, the perfect scenario for you is for him to go to Chelsea and then buy all of the players at Brentford, and then in 3 years' time, you can spend nearly 200 million in the transfer market. So that would be my ceiling. But look, it's tough, isn't it? Because as a coach of a team like Brentford, you get pigeonholed as being a certain kind of coach. I was thinking this about someone like Andoni Iraola, where with a mid-table squad, he can get a lot out of them. But then the question is, well, how would you apply that to a top-level squad? You can't really play that way with elite players. So the question then is, if he did make the step up to coaching an elite side, would he be able to make those changes? And it's sort of hard to see that. And I think the same is roughly true for Thomas Frank as well. But the question, I suppose the complexifying factor here is the fact that Brentford played, you know, more progressive football, quote unquote, in scare quotes, progressive football in the Championship to get them up. And then as soon as you got into the Premier League, it was like, right now we're staying in the leagues. And he was flexible enough to be able to change his approach in that respect. So for me, the big question is, you know, it's not is Thomas Frank a good enough coach to work at any level? I think he clearly is, right? We've talked about how he can instill his ideas in players. I suppose the question is, can he adapt himself and implement high level tactics so that a team like because a team like Manchester United can't play like Brentford, it would not work, right? If the fans were seeing that you come out like Man United come out in a sort of 5-3-2 mid block every week and sit deep, and I mean, part of the problem is that they do that, I suppose. So maybe he would be fine at Manchester United, but they always end up sort of tending towards sitting a bit deeper and then hitting on the break. So, but yeah, I suppose the question is, if a team like Manchester United wanted to make the step up to playing maybe like more possession heavy football with positional ideas and like high, not just high possession, but also, you know, the Pep Guardiola thing of like pushing the opposition back into their own box, defending through ball possession, and then having to worry about like being hit on the break. Yeah, that's I suppose that's the question, right? And whether or not the owners at Manchester United and the leadership group there want to go down that route, I don't know. There's been some interesting stuff in the mainstream media today actually on what do Ineos and the leadership group think of Erik ten Hag's game model, right? Which is, it's mad even seeing that in the mainstream media now, that like even 5 years ago, I don't think that kind of phrasing would be put out there. But that's the question. Like what elite clubs out there are thinking, right, we need a new game model. Who's the man to bring it in? Let's bring in the Brentford manager. That's a gamble for them. And that's not to say, like, with all due respect to Thomas Frank, as I said, he's a fantastic coach. And a lot of this comes down to the fact that he gets pigeonholed by being at Brentford and having to play a certain way. But it's just a gamble to know like how that transition would help. So yeah, how that transition would work. So it's sort of hard for me to say what I think his ceiling is in that respect, which is a very sort of milk toast answer for you. But yeah, it's the similar scenario that you have with Brentford, right? Which is like, how do you make the next step? What does the next step look like for him? If he's not going to go straight into a club at the highest level, then does he need like a stepping stone club between that? Does he need like an Aston Villa type club where you are able to bring in a bit more like player quality perhaps, and then make the argument? But then I mean then you get Unai Emery, right? So this is the problem. It's so hard to be successful but in a way that allows you to make the step up. Someone like Roberto De Zerbi is a good example, right, of or Vincent Kompany, right, where you almost flip it on its head, and it's like, this manager is good for their own career, the way that they play, but it's bad for the team that they're coaching. So Burnley, like, was it good that Vincent Kompany wanted to play high possession football at the bottom of the Premier League? Probably not. But it was good for his career prospects because he's now managing Bayern, right? Whereas with Brentford, it's the other way around. Is it good that you've got a manager like Thomas Frank playing the way he does in the Premier League? Yes, because he's going to do what is best for the club in terms of the game model he's going to adopt. Is it bad for his own career? Probably, because now other clubs will see him as envisaging like this style of play, which may well not be the ideal style of play that he wants to play, but he's done it so well that he almost gets seen as that kind of manager.
Well, when he was linked with the United and the Chelsea jobs, like all the replies on Twitter, I know you can't take much from Twitter because it's a cesspit at times, but all the replies to that were, we don't want, this manager from the lower reaches of the division who plays negative football with 5 at the back. But to Thomas Frank's credit, by the way, I've never heard Unai Emery used as a verb. You've just been Emery'd. That was the first time I've heard that use of that verb. But just like you mentioned, his preferred style of play and the 2 seasons in the Championship, and sometimes you can see it a little bit when we're playing inferior opposition as opposed to like the Big Six. Mm-hmm. What I will say about Thomas Frank is that he does have, I would say, Craig, like a proven track record of improving attackers in terms of Brian Mbeumo, Ollie Watkins, Said Benrahma, Ivan Toney. Those, like, the standard that he got them to play at and the amount of money we were able to sell them. Granted, Said Benrahma hasn't gone on to do great things, but Ollie Watkins, regular into England international. Ivan Toney probably would have been if he didn't go and
throw in Johan Wissa as well. Johan Wissa
and Johan Wissa,
yeah, absolutely.
So that on that, who excites you? Obviously, we've spoken about with Brian Mbeumo. I don't know if you've like looked at Brian Mbeumo's numbers, but the guy is just an output machine per 90. It's just insane. But yeah, who excites you?
I've been a massive fan of Mbeumo for years, because just an incredible. I mean, like, it's what we were talking about before. Like, he's the reason why I'm confident that you'll be a mid-table side if he stays fit. I think I'm excited about Kevin Schade. I am nominally a Freiburg fan, so I was watching Schade at Freiburg before he went across, and I think, yes, if Thomas Frank is good at developing those kind of players, then it would be great to see that. I do think that part of that is because the play style that you have is just great for those kind of players, right? The play style is designed around being able to attack directly, having really good patterns of play, and players having understandings of what to do in those direct attacks. That means that you're creating an environment where they're going to thrive, right? Partly why someone like Said Benrahma can go somewhere else and then is less impressive because he's not able to play in that way as much. So yeah, I'm excited about someone like Kevin Schade. Hopefully, Schade will be able to kick on. It's again, it's a shame that he's had like injuries holding him back. But the front line is what I'm excited about with Brentford. It's the ability to be able to produce the sorts of goals that you can produce, which is just it's relative to the level, I would say, super elite. There's not many other teams in the bottom half of the table who are able to do that. That's great. I guess the other thing is like what happens when you actually have fullbacks, right? It feels like forever since anyone who was. I mean, do you know,
what happens when you have fullbacks?
Yeah, right, exactly. But I think maybe my understated favorite Brentford player is Vitaly Janelt, because of what we talked about before. The fact that he's a Spider Bundesliga player, arrives dead cheap, and they play him left back, and God bless him, he is a terrible left back, but he does it anyway, and like he's fantastic for the level at, what he does in midfield. But when you've had games with Janelt at left back and Roerslev at right back, and you have had Rico Henry and Aaron Hickey in those two spots, and you've had to have Christopher Ayer, who again, like, I think he's a decent option if you're going to play a centre back as a fullback. But for a team that builds through the wide areas in indirect ways, like having to field defensive midfielders and centre backs as your wide defensive options, it's super impressive that you've even been able to perform at all. So again, it would be nice to see some like actual fullbacks in the team, and I think that will improve things no end. I couldn't believe it when I saw that Hickey got injured again. I mean, I could believe it, but like ridiculous that he was just coming back and then immediately was done again.
Rico Henry was supposed to play in a friendly behind closed doors today and didn't play because he's picked up a different knock in training.
But I guess it becomes a vicious cycle, right? That you're not fit enough to play and you have to get back up to fitness, and then you start getting all of these muscle tears. But again, this comes back to what we were talking about before. It's like you've got to recruit players in these positions. If you can't rely on just saying, well, Hickey's nearly back, and once he's back, he can play both sides. I remember last season you went in being like, well, Hickey can play both sides, so it's fine. We only need 3 fullbacks, right? You can do Roerslev, Henry, and Hickey, and that will cover you all. And then like 2 of them are out for most of the season. So yeah, it's depth of fullback, I think, is going to make things so much more comfortable for you guys as well.
I remember, Mike, we did the end of season quiz, and one of the questions was up until the halfway point of the season, so 19 games, how many different defensive back lines had Brentford played? So how many different variations of players? And we was at like 17 out of 19 games. We had different defenses. It was just crazy the amount of injury problems that we had.
Yeah.
John, you mentioned like the output of Kevin Schade, who, by the way, was very unlucky not to score on the weekend, I thought. He obviously hit the post for Brian's first goal, and then he gets a free header inside the 6-yard box, which unfortunately drops into Ramsdale's arms. But Mike listed loads of players, and then you threw Yoane Wissa in there as well.
Yeah.
Yoane Wissa is now 10 goal contributions in 10 games, 7 goals, 3 assists. Prior to the Liverpool game, he was the first player since Riyad Mahrez to score and assist in 3 consecutive Premier League games, which goes back to 2019. Now that Ivan's gone to Saudi Arabia and we don't have that target man player, do you think that he can fill his boots? Now, I know that's a completely different player, a completely different style of play in which we're going to have to play with Wissa, because we can't do that route one to the striker, get the ball down, play in. But his as well as Brian's, like Mike said, he's a goal contribution machine. Wissa is much of the same. Do you think that the front 3 maybe in whole could fill the void in which Ivan Toney is going to leave in the squad?
Yeah, absolutely. I'm a massive fan of Yoane Wissa. I actually play I don't play fantasy football, but I do play a draft with my mates, and we do not the top 9. Well, that's what we're doing this season. So we're not allowed to pick anyone from the top 9 teams. So Yoane Wissa was my first pick straight in, because I was like, this guy, like you say, he's gonna get goals that I think Brentford will be relative to the level of the teams that we can pick from, and that 11 teams that are left. I think he's going to be super important to them. So yeah, I'm a massive fan of Wissa, and I think just the way that you're playing this season, where you're playing like this 4-3-3, where the player on the left sort of drops in to help, and then you almost have like Mbemo and Wissa as like the two front line. I just think it works really nicely. Just making sure those two are high up out of possession, so that when you win the ball back, you can get the ball forward to them. I think it's going to be, like you say, it's going to be different from what we saw when Ivan Toney was around, but I don't think that it's going to be any worse. And you could maybe even argue that it sort of works better because it's a lot more of a mobile front line, and you get both of them working pretty hard out of possession. And as we were saying, like if you're going to attack at a pace through the wide areas and have those two just running in behind, I think there already has been a lot of goals. So.
We've said it many times. Mike did a piece recently with Sky Sports talking about Ivan Toney going to Saudi Arabia as well. And when they asked the question, like you said, we probably play better football without Ivan Toney. And I argued that case so many times last season after he came back. And then he got picked up a knock, didn't he? So we had that front three and I was loving it because it looked more exciting. As someone who maybe watches Brentford from a neutral perspective, do you think that the football is different or the football is better without Ivan in the team? Because I would argue it is. Yeah, more pleasing on the eye anyway.
Yeah. Again, like we were saying before, when you're playing the way that Brentford do, which is, it's solid football with outlier players, I think, you are always going to miss a player like Ivan Toney, right? He has the ability to, change a game in moments, right? And you could argue whether or not he's better or worse at that than Mbemo, I think. Most people, I think, wouldn't with Wissa. But I think when you've got two of those players in your front line and you have a system that works for both of them, there's no reason why it can't be as functional and almost like functional in a way where you're getting more upside out of it than having to rely on a player for moments, right? So, yeah, I think... Look, people enjoy football in different ways. So, some people would enjoy watching a player like Toney over Wissa and Mbemo. But personally, I think that front line looks more dangerous than it has done. Again, with the caveat that it's been, maybe it's because it's been so long since I've watched Ivan Toney play properly, because it's been a long time since he's played properly, right? So maybe this is just hindsight bias or the opposite of hindsight bias, recency bias that's getting me. But I think that front line of Mbemo, Wissa, and then insert other, probably Kevin Schade, is more than good enough to keep you in the Premier League and more than good enough to actually get you mid-table. So yeah, the question is what happens around it, right? With the injury issues and the fact that you have a very sort of thin roster of players for that midfield as well.
Just before we finish, because I realise that we've been going on quite a while now, I was going to ask some wider Premier League questions, but maybe we'll just do some quick predictions at the end. We've gone a whole podcast without speaking about Ivan Toney in depth, which I think is a win because that's probably the first time ever. But I do just want to maybe just talk about him just a little bit, because obviously huge news. He's gone to Saudi about a week ago on deadline day, and it all felt a little bit underwhelming from a neutral's perspective. How good did you think Ivan Toney was, and sort of what were your thoughts on the move to Saudi?
Yeah, it's a tricky one. I think I've maybe always been a bit lower on Ivan Toney than a lot of people. Right. So I guess I look at that situation and I think it's good for Brentford because you've got money for him. There's that whole concatenation of events that have like gone against him and have gone against you by dint of the fact that, we're talking a player that probably would have gone for 70 million had he not had that gambling ban. With all of that said, I do think that him going to Saudi, I mean, again, people will have different opinions on what constitutes a successful footballing career, whatever. And, I'm pleased that Ivan Toney can go and, make bag for what's probably his last contract, right? That's all fine. It is whatever. He probably would have wanted to do that playing Champions League football. It hasn't transpired that way. So I'm happy that he's gone somewhere where he feels as though he can, do that. But at the same time, like I'm sort of pleased for Brentford that they've managed to actually get something back for him, because I feel as though they've been very good for a club through that scenario, in a situation where they actually lost a lot of value, presumably, through it happening. So it's nice to see them getting some money back for it, and hopefully, they'll be able to invest that money better than they've been investing money more recently. And but that's the thing, right? Is that when you get those players in, there's always the tension between wanting to keep a player like that in the team, because it's so clear that he was a sort of game changer player, ceiling raiser player, that you've got to get the balance right between keeping them long enough to get the most out of them as you can on the pitch, and then getting the most out of them off the pitch when you then sell them. And so, I guess I look back on it maybe fairly dispassionately. Maybe that's the miserable football analyst in me, but given what happened, I think that's probably what happened this summer was probably the best case scenario for what could have happened.
Well, plus it means we don't have to watch him play against us.
Yeah, that's true.
Exactly. I think it's definitely just I would have liked to see him play some Champions League football, because, being on, despite, the kind of bad blood between Brentford fans and Ivan Toney at points, it would have been really cool to see someone doing it in the Champions League, like I think he would have if he'd have signed for a bigger club. So I just think it's a bit of a shame.
Yeah, and you've presumably not had many experiences of watching a player leave and then go and do bigger things. I mean, there's obviously Stuart Dallas and Adam Forshaw, of course. But apart from those two, I can't really think of many chances that you've had to watch players leave and then, succeed at a high level. And I think there's a lot of enjoyment of that as football fans, right? Because it feels as though you play some part in that, and your club has helped a player step up, right?
Well, I mean, that's what kind of happened when Ollie Watkins scored at the Euros.
Watkins,
obviously,
of course,
there was a kind of flashpoint between Brentford fans and Ollie Watkins last season when he scored against us for Villa. But there was definitely a part of me that was super happy for him when he scored against the Netherlands, because it was like he's been part of our journey. We've kind of contributed to that goal in a weird way.
Yeah,
but
no, absolutely. And it's like my club is doing something sensible and smart, and is like making players better, and that's what you want. Like, there's a part of that I think is undervalued as fans, that you like to see your team doing things that are like is good. And that's why I've never really understood fans of like clubs that are right at the elite level who aren't that smart, right? Who just spend loads of money, and it's just like, oh great, well you won. Of course you did. You spent $1 billion in the last 4 seasons or something. It's nice as being a fan of a smaller club to see someone make that step up from your club somewhere else and succeed, and be like, yeah, that's because our club did the right thing. They brought them from a lower level, nurtured them, and then let them go on and do what they wanted to do in the future as well.
100%. John, I was going to ask some questions about the wider Premier League, but should we just do some predictions now? We're 3 seasons in. I want your Premier League winner and your 3 teams to go down.
Well, so only one acceptable winner, by the way.
Yeah, Brentford obviously win the Premier League. Yeah. No, I went with Arsenal in our preview, in our sort of season starting preview, and I'm starting to regret that. I think City are looking pretty ominous, and Arsenal are not. But we'll see. Arsenal have a funny way of like looking fairly turgid and still winning. So maybe they'll come on through for me. And then what was it? The 3 teams going down? Mm-hmm. Yeah, 3 promoted sides going down.
Don't give them a chance.
No chance. No.
No.
I think that's the reality now. The Premier League is becoming a closed shop. It's very, very hard to stay up unless someone at the bottom of the table has a bit of a nightmare. So, yeah.
Do you think it's getting worse and worse every single season? Because like I've spoken about it in terms of Brentford sort of staying in the Premier League for 4 seasons and how that kind of goes under the radar a little bit. But then I look back and I think, well, was it easier for us going in 4 seasons ago as opposed to Ipswich coming up this season?
Yeah. I mean, I think there's maybe again a bit of recency bias coming in for me, but when you look at all of the teams that go up and you look at, I mean, which team finished just above the relegation zone? Was it Forest?
Yeah, Forest and us.
Yeah, so Forest and Brentford. You look at those teams, and look, I watched Forest Wolves the other day because I've been making an effort. I've been forced by my colleague Alex Barker to watch some of the teams that we don't often watch. So we watched a couple of their games together, and I got the benefit from it. But those teams are like remarkably like again, it's very similar stuff. It's like solid structure and a few like decent players around. So you talk about Wolves. Like Wolves have got Mateus Cunha, who was playing at Atletico Madrid there. Jorgen Strand Larsen up front. They've got players like Ryan Ait-Nouri. They've got Semedo, who's a former Barca player. So they've got like quality relative to the bottom half of the Premier League dotted around them, and then they play really structured, like well coached, sensible football, and that's what you need to stay up. And then you see the teams now coming up, and it's like, okay, a lot of them, yes, good coaches there, but you have coaches like Russell Martin, and the whole conversation is going to be about the way that they set up, and is he just doing another Vincent Kompany? Incidentally, I actually think that when you actually watch what Southampton are doing, the issue isn't that they're playing possession football. The issue is that they're playing bad possession football, and that's a conversation that needs to be had. That's a different matter entirely. But then you talk about like Ipswich with Kieran McKenna, like that squad that's coming up it's a squad that was largely in League One 2 seasons ago. And then Leicester City have, maybe, I mean, Leicester could maybe do it. They've got quality in that squad. They've got away with breaking financial rules, I suppose. But even still, it's like they are at the bottom of that race to safety, because they're coming up against teams like Forest, who spent a shit ton. They're coming up against Brentford, who are really well run. And then, okay, Everton, always chaotic, but like, again, Sean Dyche has it within him to keep them up, even though people seem to be doubting him at the moment. They have quality players there as well. It's just super hard, I think, for any team that is going to come up next season to be able to be at the level to compete. And I think part of the problem is that once you have a few seasons where the bottom 3 go down, the 3 that went up, they're just not able to consolidate, and the teams in that league are then able to consolidate. And the only thing that's going to upset that apple cart is going to be having just a disaster season. So yeah, it just feels like it's a race, and the 3 teams that are going up now seem just like they're starting a lap behind everyone else, which is miserable. But that's the world that we created by making the Premier League the richest league in the world. So I can understand, maybe comes full circle, I can understand why the ownership of Brentford will be like, all we need to do is stay in the league, because if you drop out of that league now, it's looking increasingly hard to get back in it.
Yeah, for sure. John, that was really, really fun, man. It was really, really fun. The Eden Road podcast will be back with a City preview, I believe. I'm going on holiday though, Craig, so you might have to fill in for that one, but I've not told you about that yet. So, but yeah, keep your eyes peeled across the socials for that. Remember to drop a comment down below with your thoughts on the episode. Something a bit different today, so do let us know if you enjoyed it. Subscribe to the YouTube and Spotify channels, and like I said, follow us on the socials at Eden Road on Twitter and at Eden Road Pod on Instagram. John, Craig, that was an absolute pleasure, guys. Thank you so much.
Thanks a lot, John.
Thanks for having me, guys. It's been great.